September 12th, 1683. In 2 hours, 18,000 winged horsemen will either save Europe from total destruction or watch Christianity be erased from the map forever. But first, you need to understand how the world's most powerful empire came within minutes of conquering everything you know about Western civilization. To understand this moment, you have to understand the man who brought the Ottoman Empire to the gates of Europe's heart. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier, was consumed by one obsession: capturing Vienna, the golden apple that would make him the greatest conqueror in Ottoman history. He had risen through the ranks of the Ottoman court through cunning and ruthlessness, but he had never achieved the one prize that would cement his legacy. Vienna would be that prize. But he had no idea what was waiting for him in the north. For years, he had watched other generals return to Constantinople with tribute and slaves, earning the Sultan's favor and vast riches. But none had delivered a conquest that would rival the great victories of the past. None had taken a prize that would echo through history like the fall of Constantinople itself. In the spring of 1683, he assembled an army that defied imagination. Modern estimates place it at over 200,000 men, a force larger than most European countries could field. This wasn't just an army. It was a migration of nations. Turks, Tatars, Wallachians, Moldavians, and Hungarian rebels marched under the crescent banner. They brought with them massive siege cannons, thousands of sappers trained in underground warfare, and a supply train that stretched for miles across the landscape. The Ottoman Empire was at the absolute peak of its power. For 3 centuries, it had been the terror of Europe, swallowing kingdoms and empires with methodical precision. They had perfected the art of siege warfare, combining traditional tactics with the devastating power of gunpowder artillery. Their janissaries were the finest infantry in the world, raised from childhood to be perfect soldiers. From the walls of Vienna, all of Europe lay open before them. The German states, weakened by decades of religious wars. France, distracted by its own territorial ambitions. Poland, isolated and surrounded by hostile powers. As this vast host moved through the Balkans like a slow-moving storm, refugees fled before it in terror. Villages emptied, towns surrendered without resistance. The message was clear. The Ottoman Empire had come to finish what it had started centuries before. This time, there would be no stopping at convenient borders. This time, they would take it all. The city that stood in their path was hardly prepared for such a test. Vienna in 1683 was a beautiful imperial capital, the seat of Habsburg power and the jewel of the Holy Roman Empire. But it was not a fortress built to withstand the world's most advanced siege army. Its walls were old, constructed for medieval warfare, not for the massive cannons that had already shattered the legendary defenses of Constantinople. Inside those walls, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg commanded a garrison of barely 15,000 men. He was a competent soldier with years of experience, but he understood the brutal mathematics of siege warfare. Against Kara Mustafa's multitudes, his small force could only hope to buy time. Time for relief to arrive. Time for a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing day. The siege began in July, and from the very first day, it was a nightmare of fire and steel. The Ottomans began an immediate, systematic assault on Vienna's defenses. Turkish sappers started digging a complex network of tunnels beneath the city's walls. They would pack these tunnels with barrels of gunpowder and detonate massive explosions that could blow breaches wide enough for entire regiments to pour through. Above ground, the giant cannons spoke day and night in a thunderous chorus of destruction. The bombardment was relentless and methodical, targeting specific sections of the ancient walls with precision that turned stone and mortar into clouds of deadly debris. The constant thunder of artillery, the screams of the wounded, the acrid smoke that never cleared. It wore down the defenders' spirits as surely as it wore down their walls. Inside the city, conditions grew desperate with terrifying speed. The Ottoman blockade was complete, cutting off all supply lines. Food ran out within the first few weeks. The citizens were reduced to eating their horses, then their dogs, then the rats that infested the cellars and sewers. Some even resorted to boiling leather belts and shoes to make a thin, bitter soup that provided just enough sustenance to keep them alive another day. Disease spread through the crowded quarters, where families huddled together for protection from the constant bombardment. Dysentery and typhus claimed lives daily. Children died in their mothers' arms, while fathers stood helpless, their own strength sapped by starvation and despair. But Starhemberg refused to surrender, even as his advisors whispered that resistance was futile. He knew that Vienna was more than just another city. It was the gateway to all of Europe. If it fell, the continent would be defenseless against the Ottoman tide. Every day the city held was another day for help to arrive. By September, the situation had become truly desperate. The outer walls had been breached in multiple places. Ottoman forces had established footholds in the outer suburbs and were fighting a vicious street-by-street battle toward the city center. Turkish soldiers could be seen from the main fortress, so close that defenders could hear their war cries and smell the smoke from their cooking fires. The city's fall seemed not just inevitable, but imminent. What the desperate defenders didn't know was that salvation was already thundering toward them across the plains of Hungary. If you're enjoying this incredible story of courage against impossible odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what other epic battles from history you'd love to see covered next. 300 miles to the north, in the royal palace of Warsaw, King Jan III Sobieski was making the decision that would define his reign and alter the course of European history. He was not a young man at 54, but he had already established himself as one of Europe's greatest military minds, earning fame for his brilliant victories against the Ottomans in the Ukrainian steppes. But this would be his greatest test, the moment that would either crown his career with immortal glory or destroy his kingdom entirely. Sobieski faced an agonizing choice. Poland had no formal alliance with Austria. In fact, the two kingdoms had been enemies for much of the previous century. Many of his own nobles argued passionately that Austria's destruction would only benefit Poland. "Let the Habsburgs fall," they whispered. "Let Poland emerge as the dominant force in Eastern Europe." The arguments were compelling from a purely political standpoint. Austria had never been a friend to Poland. Why should Polish blood be spilled to save Austrian cities? But Sobieski saw what others couldn't or wouldn't see. If Vienna fell, Poland would be next on the Ottoman list. The empire didn't conquer territories to stop at convenient borders. It conquered to keep conquering, to expand until the entire world lay under the crescent banner. Today Vienna, tomorrow Krakow. Today Austria, tomorrow Poland. The king understood with crystal clarity that this wasn't Austria's war against the Ottomans. This was Europe's war for survival. And if Europe fell piecemeal, nation by nation, then no Christian kingdom would remain standing. More than strategic calculation, though, Sobieski was a man who lived for glory and honor. He commanded the most famous heavy cavalry in the world, the legendary winged Hussars. These weren't just soldiers in his service. They were legends made flesh, the embodiment of Polish military tradition stretching back centuries. The winged Hussars were unlike any military unit in history. Each rider was a Polish nobleman, trained from childhood in the arts of war and mounted on the finest horses that money could buy. They wore elaborate armor polished to a mirror shine that could blind enemies even at a distance. Each carried an 18-foot lance made of hollow wood that could punch through any armor known to man, light enough to wield with deadly precision, but strong enough to shatter shield and bone alike. But it was their wings that made them truly legendary. Enormous feathered wings, some reaching 15 feet in height, were attached to wooden frames on their backs or mounted on their horses. In battle, these wings created a terrifying spectacle that had broken enemy morale before the first lance was lowered. thousands of armored angels descending on their enemies with the sound of thunder, the rustle of feathers mixing with the thunder of hooves to create a symphony of terror. The wings served practical purposes beyond their psychological impact. They made noise, a constant rustling that unnerved enemy horses and masked the sound of the approaching charge until it was too late. They made the riders appear larger and more imposing, but most importantly, they created an identity that transcended mere military function. The winged hussars weren't just cavalry. They were the embodiment of Polish pride, Polish honor, and Polish military tradition. Sobieski knew that leading his hussars to Vienna would be the defining moment of his entire reign. Win, and he would be remembered forever as the savior of Europe. Lose, and Poland itself might not survive the Ottoman onslaught that would surely follow. It was a gamble with the highest possible stakes, but it was a gamble the warrior king was prepared to take. He sent word to his commanders across Poland. The kingdom would march to Vienna. The winged hussars would ride again. While Sobieski made his momentous decision, other powers across Europe were stirring from their paralysis. Pope Innocent XI used every tool of diplomacy and religious authority at his disposal to forge a coalition against the common threat. His envoys carried a simple, urgent message to every Christian court in Europe. Vienna must not fall. Duke Charles of Lorraine, commanding what remained of the imperial forces in Austria, became the coordinator of what would become known as the Holy League. Getting different armies from different countries to work together effectively had always been nearly impossible in European warfare. Language barriers made communication difficult. Conflicting command structures led to confusion and rivalry. Old resentments and territorial disputes usually doomed such alliances before they could take the field effectively. But the Ottoman threat was so overwhelming that traditional enemies found common cause in ways that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Bavarian troops prepared to march alongside Austrian forces they had fought against in previous wars. Saxon soldiers made ready to share camps with Polish knights who spoke a different language and followed different customs. The race against time was agonizing. Every day brought increasingly desperate reports from Vienna about the city's deteriorating condition. Ottoman tunnels had blown massive gaps in the walls that defenders struggled desperately to repair. Turkish soldiers were fighting in the city's outer districts, so close to victory that they could taste it. Charles of Lorraine sent encouraging messages to the desperate garrison, promising that help was coming. But privately, he wondered whether they could arrive in time. The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The various armies would gather on the Kahlenberg Heights, the hills overlooking Vienna from the northwest. From there, they would launch a coordinated attack designed to break the siege and destroy Kara Mustafa's army in a single decisive battle. It was all or nothing. They would have one chance to save Vienna and stop the Ottoman advance. If they failed, Europe would be defenseless. By early September, through a combination of military genius, diplomatic skill, and sheer luck, the impossible had been achieved. Nearly 70,000 men from across the Holy Roman Empire and Poland had assembled in the Vienna woods. It was the largest Christian army gathered in over a century, united by a common cause and commanded by some of Europe's most capable generals. But would it be enough to break an Ottoman force that had seemed invincible for months? September 12th dawned clear and bright, a perfect day for what everyone knew would be the decisive battle. From the Kahlenberg Heights, the coalition forces could see the entire scope of the Ottoman siege spread out across the plains below, like a vast city of tents and siege works. Smoke rose from dozens of fires where Turkish engineers continued their relentless mining operations. The ancient walls of Vienna were pockmarked with craters and gaps, testament to months of constant bombardment. Inside the city, Starhemberg's exhausted garrison prepared for what they knew might be their final day. Ottoman forces had breached the outer defenses in multiple places, and were fighting a desperate street-by-street battle toward the city center. The Count himself had been wounded in the morning's fighting when an Ottoman grenade exploded near his command post, but he refused to leave his position. Vienna had held for 2 agonizing months against impossible odds. He would not let it fall on his watch. The battle began at dawn, with the thunderous roar of coalition cannons echoing across the valley like the voice of an angry god. Charles of Lorraine led the initial assault, sending his imperial forces crashing into the Ottoman left flank with devastating effect. The surprise was complete and overwhelming. Kara Mustafa had been so focused on taking Vienna that he had failed to adequately prepare defensive positions against forces attacking from the heights. But the Ottomans were not easily broken, even when caught off guard. These were veteran troops who had conquered territories stretching from Baghdad to Vienna. They rallied quickly from the initial shock, turning to face this new threat while maintaining pressure on the city. The fighting was vicious and confused, with battle lines shifting rapidly as both sides struggled for advantage. For hours, the outcome hung in perfect balance. Ottoman janissaries fought with desperate courage, born of the knowledge that defeat here would mean the end of their empire's dreams of European conquest. Turkish cavalry charged again and again into the coalition lines, trying to break the coordinated assault through sheer audacity and skill. But gradually, inexorably, the weight of numbers and the advantage of surprise began to tell in favor of the coalition. The Ottoman forces had been caught stretched thin by the long siege, with troops and resources committed to the bombardment when they should have been preparing defensive positions. It was at this critical moment that Jan Sobieski made his decision. Watching the battle unfold from the heights, studying the ebb and flow of combat with the eye of a master tactician, he could see that the Ottoman forces were wavering but not yet broken. One decisive blow, one overwhelming show of force, could shatter them completely. One perfectly timed charge could turn retreat into rout and victory into total annihilation. He turned to his officers, the cream of Polish nobility who had followed him across hundreds of miles to this moment, and gave the order that would echo through history and legend. "Gentlemen, we charge." The sight that followed had never been seen before in the history of warfare, and would never be seen again. 18,000 horsemen, the flower of Polish nobility and the pride of European chivalry, formed up for the largest cavalry charge in human history. At their center rode the winged Hussars, their armor gleaming like silver in the afternoon sun, their wings spread wide like instruments of divine judgment descending from heaven itself. Sobieski himself led the charge, his royal banner flying proudly above the thundering mass of men and horses. The ground literally shook with the impact of thousands of hooves striking the earth in unison. The air filled with an incredible symphony of sound, the rustle and flap of thousands of wings, the thunder of hooves, the war cries of knights who knew they were making history with every stride their horses took. The Ottoman lines didn't just break under the impact of this supernatural assault. They disintegrated completely. Soldiers who had never known defeat, who had conquered half the known world and considered themselves invincible, threw down their weapons and ran in absolute terror. The sight of those armored angels descending from the hills with the speed and power of a hurricane shattered something fundamental in the Ottoman army's collective spirit. Kara Mustafa, watching his grand design collapse in the space of mere minutes, tried desperately to rally his men and restore some semblance of order to the chaos. But panic is contagious, and it spread through the Ottoman ranks like wildfire consuming dry grass. The army that had seemed invincible just hours before was now nothing more than a mob of terrified fugitives streaming away from the battlefield in every direction. The Polish cavalry crashed through the Ottoman camp like an unstoppable force of nature. Tents were trampled under the hooves of war horses. Siege equipment was captured or destroyed. The vast treasure that was to have funded further conquests was scattered to the winds. Sobieski himself reached the walls of Vienna as the sun began to set, the first relief commander to actually touch the ancient stones of the city he had come so far to save. Want to see more epic stories of courage and triumph against impossible odds? Hit that like button and share this with someone who loves incredible history. Inside Vienna, the starving defenders watched in amazement as their enemies fled in all directions. Men who had been preparing to die that very day instead found themselves celebrating the most complete military victory in European history. Church bells that had been silent for months under the constant threat of Ottoman cannons rang out across the city in joyous celebration that could be heard for miles. The victory was absolute and total. The Ottoman army, which had taken months to assemble and had seemed unstoppable just days before, was utterly destroyed as an effective fighting force. Kara Mustafa's dreams of conquest died in the Vienna woods, along with any realistic hope of Ottoman expansion into the heart of Europe. The Grand Vizier himself survived the battle, but his disgrace was complete and irreversible. When news of the disaster reached Sultan Mehmed IV in Constantinople, Kara Mustafa was immediately summoned back to the capital. There, on December 25th, Christmas Day, in a final irony, he was executed by strangulation with a silk cord, the traditional punishment reserved for failed Ottoman commanders. Sobieski's victory message to the Pope became one of the most famous dispatches in military history. We came, we saw, God conquered. It was a deliberate echo of Julius Caesar's famous Veni, Vidi, Vici, but with a humility that acknowledged the divine hand in such an impossible triumph against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Vienna marked far more than just another military victory in the endless wars that plagued Europe. It marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's long, slow decline from the heights of power. Never again would Turkish armies march deep into the heart of Europe. Never again would the crescent banner threaten the great capitals of Christendom. The empire that had once seemed destined to conquer the entire known world began its gradual retreat back toward the Bosphorus. The charge of the winged Hussars stands as one of history's greatest examples of how courage and determination can triumph over seemingly impossible odds, and how sometimes the fate of entire civilizations can be decided in a single thunderous moment when heroes rise to meet their destiny. If this story of courage and triumph inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales from history, and let us know in the comments what other epic battles you'd love to see brought to life. Together, we'll keep these amazing stories alive for future generations to discover and be inspired by.